Her voice was never recorded. In the vast archives of history, where empires rise and fall, where great speeches echo through time, you will not find her name. She lived a life not of public acclaim, but of quiet, profound influence. Her story is the story of countless women whose contributions have been written not in ink, but in the very fabric of the communities they sustained. As time passed, her silence became more practiced. She learned when to speak softly and when not to speak at all. This wasn't weakness. It was a form of adaptation, a strategy for survival. In a world where her voice was not expected to be loud, she understood that survival often required careful judgment rather than open resistance. She saw the world with a clarity born from experience. She recognized the patterns of power and exclusion, how certain decisions were always made elsewhere, by others, in rooms she would never enter. Her role, as she saw it, was to navigate the consequences, to steer her family and her community through the currents created by distant hands. Change was something discussed in faraway places. New ideas about rights and reform slowly trickled into public conversation, but these discussions rarely included women like her. Progress existed, but it moved unevenly, like a wave that lifts some boats while leaving others untouched on the shore. She would watch as others gained recognition for ideas she had embodied for years. It was a strange paradox. Words spoken in a public forum carried more weight than actions lived out in the quiet privacy of daily life. This imbalance was simply accepted as the natural order of things, and so her countless contributions remained unnamed, uncelebrated. But within her own small world, her influence was undeniable. It was a quiet power, but a powerful one nonetheless. People sought her advice, not in grand meetings, but in hushed conversations over a cup of tea or during a walk down a familiar path. Her judgment guided choices, resolved disputes, and prevented harm. She was the anchor in the storm, the calm presence that could diffuse tension when anger threatened to boil over. She encouraged restraint where recklessness might have caused irreparable damage. These moments, these small interventions, shaped lives and altered destinies, though history, with its focus on battles and decrees, never noticed. She was a living library, a keeper of knowledge passed down through generations. This wasn't the kind of knowledge found in books. It was practical wisdom, cultural memory, and moral guidance. It was how to heal, how to grow, how to mend, and how to endure. None of it was written down, yet all of it was essential for survival and for the continuation of her culture. As she grew older and her physical strength began to wane, her insight only sharpened. The younger generations would gather around her, listening, even if they didn't always fully understand the depth of her words. Her legacy was not chiseled in stone. It moved through people, a living current of wisdom passed from one heart to another. The world around her did slowly transform. New laws appeared on paper, promising fairness and representation for all. But she knew that systems change much faster on the page than they do in practice. For her, the daily reality remained largely the same. The rhythms of her life, caring for others, offering counsel, holding the community together, were unchanged by the political winds. She never expected recognition. To expect anything, she felt, was to invite disappointment. Hope was a fragile thing, expressed cautiously, if at all. Acceptance wasn't resignation. It became a form of protection, a shield for her spirit in a world that wasn't ready to see her. When she was no longer present, her passing was marked by no public announcement. No flags were lowered. The world, it seemed, continued without pause. History moved forward, its grand narrative marching on without her name. But to say she left no trace would be untrue. You could find her everywhere if you knew where to look. You could see her in the habits and values of her children and their children. You could hear her in the lessons they passed on without attribution. You could feel her in the resilience they learned from watching her endure, from witnessing her quiet, unyielding strength. Her story, the story of the unrecorded woman, challenges the very way we think about history. It forces us to ask, whose voices do we consider worthy of preservation? Whose stories get told, and whose are left to fade into silence? It reveals how much we lose, how much our understanding of the past is distorted when we only listen to the loudest voices. The silence of women like her is not an empty space. It's a profound absence that speaks volumes about what our societies have chosen to value. Remembering women like her is not about rewriting history with fictional triumphs. It is about completing it. It's about pulling back the curtain to reveal the foundational work that has always sustained societies. It's about acknowledging the lives that, while never officially recognized, were utterly indispensable. Her story continues long after her lifetime. Its impact is still felt today in the very structure of our world. And now, the absence of her voice speaks more loudly than ever. It doesn't ask for pity or praise. It simply demands that we listen, that we reflect, and that we commit to telling a more complete, more honest story of who we are. Thank you for listening. Have you ever thought about the voices missing from our history books? We hear about kings, presidents, and generals. But what about the countless others whose stories were never written down, whose voices were never recorded? Today, we're going to talk about one of them, a woman who lived a life of quiet impact, but whose story reveals a much larger truth about what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. In her later years, the world started buzzing with new ideas. Words like rights and equality began to fill public spaces, promising a fairer future for everyone. But for her, this progress felt distant, like a storm brewing on a far-off horizon. These changes came too late. They arrived long after her life had already been defined by a world that wasn't ready to listen. Her voice, her thoughts, her experiences, they were never captured by a microphone or a pen. History simply moved on without her. As the years rolled by, history wrote its own story, a very selective one. It highlighted the big moments, the loud leaders, the landmark laws. It was a story of visible, public change, but it left out the quiet, everyday acts of survival and resilience that made all of that change possible. In these official narratives, her life was an unwritten page. Her absence wasn't even noticed. It was as if she, and millions like her, were just part of the background scenery, not the main characters of their own lives. But just because her voice wasn't recorded doesn't mean her influence vanished. It lived on, woven into the fabric of the community she was a part of. It echoed in the values she quietly practiced and passed down to her children, and her children's children. Her legacy survived, not in books or monuments, but in the people she guided, nurtured, and protected. It was an anonymous legacy, a powerful current flowing beneath the surface of official history. Stories like hers expose the limits of what we think of as history. They show us that our archives, our libraries, our museums, they are all incomplete. They were never designed to capture everything. What gets written down often has more to do with power than with truth. It's a reflection of who had the ability to tell their story and who was silenced. And sometimes, what's missing from the record is what matters the most. It's in those gaps, in those silences, that we can find a deeper understanding of our past. Remembering her, and women like her, isn't just about nostalgia. It's an act of responsibility. It forces us to question the comfortable, streamlined versions of the past we've been taught. It challenges us to lean in and listen for the voices that history tried to ignore. It makes us ask a critical question. Why were they excluded in the first place? What systems were in place that decided whose story was worth telling and whose was not? Her silence was never a choice. It wasn't a sign that she had nothing to say or nothing to feel. It was the direct result of a world that placed heavy restrictions on her, that actively denied her a platform. Understanding this crucial difference helps us separate absence from insignificance. Just because someone is silent doesn't mean they consent. Just because someone isn't seen doesn't mean they aren't there. Her silence was imposed, not chosen. Today, her story speaks to us in a different way. It's a powerful warning against our modern obsession with visibility. It reminds us that a person's worth shouldn't be measured by their follower count, their public profile, or how loud their voice is. It teaches us that for progress to be real, it has to be inclusive. It has to lift up everyone, not just the people already standing in the spotlight. True recognition shouldn't depend on who holds the power. When we make the effort to tell stories like hers, we're not rewriting facts or inventing a new past. We are restoring balance. We are widening the lens, showing a more complete and honest picture of what happened. We are making history more human. By bringing these forgotten lives out of the shadows, we honor their existence and acknowledge their contribution, no matter how quiet it was. This is how history grows, evolves, and becomes a better teacher for us all. Her life demonstrates a profound truth. Dignity can exist without public acknowledgement. A person can live a meaningful, impactful life without ever being famous or celebrated. But justice, that's another story. Justice requires memory. It requires us to remember. If we forget the lives that were pushed to the margins, we make it easier for the same injustices to happen again. But if we remember them, if we tell their stories, we build a foundation of accountability. We strengthen our collective resolve to do better. The lesson here is quiet but firm. History is a delicate thing. It must be handled with care, with humility, and with an awareness of its own limitations. Every voice that was denied, every story that was lost, leaves a gap in our shared human understanding. And it is our responsibility, right here, right now, to start filling in those gaps. Not just for the sake of the past, but for the sake of our future. This was a story from the shadows of history, a story we remember today, so that its silence is never repeated. History is a story told by the winners, they say, But what if it's a story told only by those who are allowed to speak? It's a narrative built from documents, speeches, and official records. But what about the countless lives that unfolded without ever leaving a written trace? This is the story of one such life, a woman whose experiences shaped others, whose wisdom guided families, yet whose voice was never formally recorded. Her silence wasn't a choice, it was a condition of her existence. She lived in a time and a place where a person's worth was defined by strict social rules. For women, especially those from marginalized communities, being a subject of history was unthinkable. Their lives were deemed private, domestic, and therefore unimportant to the public record. As a result, their voices, their perspectives, their very existence was systematically excluded from the documents that would one day become our collective memory. She was born into a family where the primary concern was survival, not recognition. From her earliest days, her role was clearly defined by tradition and necessity. There was no time to dream of other paths, because the one she was on was already paved by expectations. Opportunities were not just limited, they were often invisible to her before she even learned how to question them. Her future was a map drawn by others. Formal education was a luxury, a privilege reserved for others, for men, for the wealthy. The world of books, of writing, of public expression existed in a different universe. But that doesn't mean she didn't learn. Her education came from the world around her. She learned through keen observation, through the quiet study of human nature. She understood how power moved, who held it, and who was crushed by it, just by watching. Her classroom was life itself, and her lessons were often harsh. Her daily life was a testament to constant, unseen labor. Her hands built and maintained the world around her. She supported households, raised families, and kept the machinery of daily routine running smoothly. The value of her contribution was immense, essential, yet it was rarely, if ever, acknowledged. It was simply expected. She learned early on that effort did not guarantee respect, and exhaustion did not earn rest. In this world, speaking up was a gamble. An honest question could be misinterpreted as defiance. A different opinion could be seen as a challenge to authority. Silence, on the other hand, was praised. It was seen as a sign of good character, of obedience, of knowing one's place. Over time, this forced restraint became a habit, a second nature. She learned to hold her tongue not just for safety, but because it was the only way she knew how to be. She was a silent witness to history unfolding in her own backyard. She saw leaders change, new rules enforced, and the priorities of her community shift. These were the very events that historians would later write about, that politicians would debate. But her perspective, the view from the ground, was never requested. She experienced the consequences, but her testimony was never sought. Despite this enforced silence, she formed her own strong opinions. She recognized injustice when she saw it, felt it in her bones. She understood the vast, cruel gap between the laws written in books and the justice lived on the streets. But this deep understanding didn't grant her a platform. It didn't give her permission to speak. It was a truth she held within, a silent, heavy burden. And so, her influence was channeled into other avenues, quiet and personal. Relationships became her domain of power. Her advice wasn't delivered in public speeches. It was whispered in private conversations. Her guidance wasn't written into law. It was passed through gentle instruction and steadfast example. Her impact traveled through people, not through paper. It rippled through her family, her neighbors, and the children who learned from watching her every move. They relied on her judgment, trusted her insight. Yet none of this powerful, subtle influence, would ever make it into an official archive. Her life followed the steady, demanding rhythm of obligation. Change, when it did arrive, came slowly, unevenly. The grand promises of progress and reform discussed in distant public squares rarely trickled down to her world. They often stopped at the edge of her reality, like waves breaking on a forgotten shore. She learned a difficult truth. For someone like her, visibility often brought danger. To be noticed was to be vulnerable, and so staying in the shadows offered a form of protection. This delicate balance required constant vigilance, an intuitive understanding of when to be invisible and when to be silent for the sake of survival. But even in this profound silence, she carried an unshakable dignity. Her internal moral compass, her sense of right and wrong, remained strong and true. She practiced kindness wherever she could, offering compassion in a world that often showed her none. Her humanity persisted, vibrant and resilient, without ever needing or receiving external validation. As the years passed, her mind became an archive of unwritten experiences, a library of silent stories. But memory, as we all know, is fragile. It fades with time and disappears with the person who holds it. As she grew older, nothing changed in how her life was recorded. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no public acknowledgments of her long journey. Her existence, like that of millions of others, was destined to blend into the silent background of history. But we must understand, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Her story, her silence, represents the stories of countless women whose labor sustained societies, whose wisdom guided generations, and whose voices were excluded by design. Their contributions were the bedrock upon which so much of our recorded history was built, yet they remain the forgotten architects. This is why remembering her matters. It's not just about correcting the historical record. It's about understanding the very nature of history itself. It's about recognizing the structures that decide whose story is worth telling and whose is condemned to silence. By trying to hear the echoes in that silence, we begin to understand the true, complex, and often painful story of our shared past. We start to see the millions of invisible threads that hold our world together. This isn't the end of her story. In many ways, it's just the beginning of truly understanding it. We must learn to listen to the silence, to look for the stories hidden between the lines of official accounts, because in the quiet spaces, in the unrecorded lives, we find a deeper, more complete truth about who we are and how we got here.